our work meeting. We will move on to, we just finished item 3.1, we will move on to item 3.2, road improvement bond, 2021 discussion. Alan.
Okay, when I talked about the three different bond options a couple of weeks ago, I kinda, instructed that we wanted to bring at least the road one back. This is the one where we have been granted $800,000 a year from the state legislature for the next 15 years. So in order to use that money best, we're proposing that we bond roughly $10 million, which would be a $800,000 a year payment. Now, we normally would go through an underwriter and go out to the open market on this. However, since we last talked about this, we have been approached by Bank of Utah, who would like to just buy it. And at the current rates, they're offering 1.7%. Now that might change if we, because it'll take 60, 90 days if we even decide to move forward. But at this point, that's what they're talking about, is they would like more portfolio, and they're willing to come right in and buy it if we were to choose to do that. So, what's that?
No broker fees.
No, yeah, the broker fees are gone.
And they lock it in, like when you do a mortgage, you can lock it in.
Down on this.
At the day that they're bought.
Bonds are based on whatever they are that day. Yeah.
I do have another question, and hopefully it's not on another slide. When Justin did his water bond presentation, he had a whole list of cares for women.
I was just gonna ask the same question.
Where are we gonna spend this money?
So when we
Like-
go to the legislature, when the legislature has when they convene every year, we always give them a list of our roads. So this year we gave them a list of roads, and it was kind of said, we're tired of seeing these lists every year. Here's a whole bunch of money, and go build all those roads. So these ones would go. We'd have to bring it back to council to see, but what we're focusing on is the roads that don't have development along them. We've been trying to get that 6,000 West. Main Street, and the ones that have obligations that we need to either pay back developers or something, so we can offset that. And we're really focusing on ones that we could team up with, like sewer district projects and things like that. So 6,000's probably priority number one. Main Street's probably priority number two. And then after we get past that, we can look at like 7,300 West, 6,400 West, the piece of that that gets down to the park that, we need to get from projects, so we can start looking at developing up that park. So, and then once we got to that point, we'd see how much money we had left. Really, we just start looking at our road priority list.
I just wanna see it.
Yeah,
Yeah, too.
before we approve
Remind
it,
me-
we just like to see it.
I mean, I know we just talked about 132, the tie-in. Remind me on the finance, is that one that we could look at in this, or is there a different piece of financing
That's
in
gonna
place
be
on that?
paid back with the CDA.
The CDA, okay. I just wanted,
So that one, you could offset that and collect CDA funds later. There's lots of options for that.
Okay, and
We call
two,
that right-hand, left-hand money.
okay, just so you're kind of aware of the process. Right now, we're just looking for direction as to whether or not we should continue down this road. We put a draft parameters resolution in your packet. In order for this to move forward, you would have to, at some point, if you chose to do it, you'd approve a parameters resolution, which really outlines the outside boundaries of what you'll accept in a bond. We would then have to have there's a 30-day period plus a public hearing. So, even if you were to go on your shortest time frame, approving a parameters resolution in July, you'd be looking at September or so for funding. So, if you choose not to do a parameters resolution, then that's that. But that would be the next step, along with getting Lake's list. So.
what's the difference in total value that we would receive, if we were to just take it over time as prescribed by the, what is it, $800,000 a year for 15 years? What's the actual?
12.5 million.
The other question I have too is
12.4 million.
obviously, I mean, there's always a risk that we don't get that money, right? And what's our contingency plan if we don't get that money?
Sorry, I was right.
12 million.
Well,
Time value. What's the
I think we would be,
projects with this?
we would probably be offering sales tax or impact fees as backup collateral for that. We'd have to have something because, typically you have to have 1.5 to 2 times coverage on a bond, okay? And the $800 payment, we're using that as 1 times coverage, so we gotta add
We got some
additional
depth.
coverage to it. So I think we would, be looking at sales tax or impact fees or another source.
The draft resolution said sales tax in it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it did, however, I suspect that within it, we might in alternate use the county option highway tax or the Class C road funds, which are set aside specifically for that. So
So we could set this up in a way that wouldn't negatively affect our bonding
we could do
capabilities
it
in the future.
however we wanna do it. Right at the current time, we have about 37 million, I think they told me, in sales tax capacity remaining. So we've got a fair amount, but we've got these other options as well.
And this will probably tie into the next conversation here of 3.3, but, of those 37 priority projects we have listed on the capital projects, how many are road improvement projects that this bond would be covering?
I can take a look really quick on our road, I actually got it open right now.
$8,995,000 worth.
None of the ones that we, in the general fund at least,
Yes. Right.
Now,
none are on
when
there.
you throw that number out there, Mayor, just understand that the bond face value would be 8,900,000, but we would be getting 10,500,000
$10,000,005 is how much.
because of the discount or the premium that would be expected. So,
So none, so there's some in the roadway impact list, but not in the general.
Say that one more time, I wanna make sure.
So the projects
This
that
would not
Blake was
affect
speaking of, it
This
was,
would not affect any of the 37 projects on there.
that's correct. Not at least with the list that we had proposed, obviously, like Blake said, we'd have to bring it to you and kind of chat through that a little bit.
but you take like the 6,000 West. It's technically an impact fee road, but it's only a portion of it.
Portion only.
Impact fee road.
It'll be supplemented by storm drain impact, water impact, and could have some general fund potentially there as well.
I would give direction to continue moving down this path, but I'm one of 5.
I would too, I still wanna see the list and, I wanna maybe have where's Chase? He moved. To maybe give a comment about what the legislature's requirement is for that.
With those funds?
Yeah, cause I would hate to get a bond and then have another $800,000 hit on our general fund obligation, yeah.
Agreed. I'm supportive of moving to the parameters resolution. I think, again, having some discussion about what the projects are and what the responsibility of the state is, I think it's a good opportunity for us to leverage that money, and be as beneficial as we can with it.
If it's coming, I say we get it.
As soon
now,
as we
yeah.
can, yep.
Cause inflation will
Same,
eat up
same.
all of it, yeah.
Awesome.
I just need to see the details.
Yeah, I agree, the details are absolutely part of that, but.
Inflation is gonna be more than 1.706%, so
Absolutely.
it's way better deal for us.
Absolutely.
Are you interested in what type of detail on the project list? Do you just want project names, or do you wanna know like what the improvements, like
I want it to look like.
landscaping, lighting?
You got that.
Uh-oh. I saw that look.
Cause roads have a lot of components, so
Right.
you want us to throw like,
Give us a reasonable expectation of what we're looking at.
we can make it 40 slides or 4.
For ET.
We'll do it smart, we'll make sure we give you enough information, but, it's just, sometimes these projects get done and then we get questioned like, why didn't you do landscaping and lighting? It's like, well, so.
Yeah.
Whatever you have envisioned that you're gonna do as a project, you know.
And every one of them's a little different, sometimes keeping in mind that if there's a piece of property that's gonna be developed and we feel like it's gonna happen soon, we might not put the sidewalk and lighting in there because someone else is gonna pay for that.
I just had communication with residents today about Rosecrest, right? Like, when is that gonna get funded? And I had to tell them, doesn't look like it's made the cut for this year.
Ooh, just got just. All right, any further discussion we need on that? Okay, we'll move on to item 3.3, general fund capital projects update. Jonathan? This is our favorite thing.
Okay, timely conversation, right? Alright.
One sec.
Oh, yeah, you bet. So, let's see, it was April 28th, we sat down with council and discussed, had a really good conversation about capital projects and prioritization, and
Love the way you phrased that.
it was a good discussion, I think. It was lively and
Lively's a
we
good word.
appreciated it. And so what I've done, I've gone back and I've listened to it, and
How many
it
times?
was great. So actually just once.
Okay.
And
Slacker.
I know. It's a tough bar to keep. So, but the thing that, to the best of my summation, I decided what the council's direction was essentially this, that we keep the baseline prioritization as it was proposed April 28th, but yet we'll bring in the directors, and have them using their discretion, understanding the city's needs, make adjustments as needed. And then we propose those as the top projects that we would recommend for the capital projects. So we've essentially done that, and I'll present that here. Now, also in the project, in the staff report, Wendy had a really good idea, which was to kind of create almost like a one-sheet project summary. So in the staff report, I didn't put it in the presentation,
It was good.
and just gave a sheet for every project. So, and it kind of gives some pretty good broad information, but not super detailed, especially since a lot of those have not been designed right. And then, so what we decided to do, and then we'll present these to you. Oh, and before I jump there, a few of the things that were brought up as I was reviewing the presentation, a lot of these things were, let's take a look at perhaps some legacy projects. The original baseline prioritization was heavily weighted towards safety, litigation, and things that just brought it right up to the top. But then we step back and say, hey, let's see what items might have a community use benefit, perhaps, or a legacy item there. And anyway, so that's kind of the items that are the things that we looked at as we made the adjustments. All right. Oh, I was looking here thinking you guys were seeing my computer. I've been past this slide. All right. So, what we did.
Can I ask one question too? In the April presentation, I thought it was 50.
It was.
Why is it only 37 now?
You're gonna have to make me remember now. So, and I might butcher this.
What were the 13 ones you took off?
Yeah, it was. We just had a little bit of money. We just got them done real quick. And so there were some recommendations made. So for 8 of those, and I don't know if the number's 8, but there were a handful of park replacement requirements, that were about $200,000 each. We made the recommendation to maybe push those into the parks general fund budget and pick one a year and put that into that particular budget as opposed to calling it a capital project. So it essentially is a replacement project that gets, maybe one or so a year.
I like that.
Justin Blake did that.
Yes.
I think that accounts for a handful of them.
There was one I remember that we got looking at, and the recent development had completed that project. It was like a piece of sidewalk, and we were like, oh, that was, I think it was done, so we looked at
So we really did do one. And then, and there were a few studies that were in there as well. We said, you know what, I think it would make more sense if, instead of calling that a capital project, let's put that under the engineering consulting budget, and we utilize that budget, budgeting that out and essentially using it there. So not putting it on the construction budget essentially.
Got it.
That's not all of the reasons, but that's probably the majority of
Okay,
sharpen our pencil.
fair enough.
Good
I'm
question.
just wondering what,
Yeah, we eliminated a bunch.
Yeah.
Good catch.
So it kinda took some off the list. So,
I was paying attention.
yeah, good job. Well done. So you'll know, so the scores that I have on here remained, they didn't change. But what we did is, we had $2 million was essentially our target on where we wanted to cap how many projects we wanted to propose. That was essentially a number. I think we were looking at a 2.5 million, but we decided we'd just stick around the $2 million mark. Now, but if you added up all these projects, you'll notice that they actually sum up to something more like well over 2 million. And the difference is what we're actually 2.8 million, 2.7 million. But so all the ponds, Shoshone Detention, Jensen Place, Antelope Meadows, and Range East are projects that are eligible for ARP. Did I get that acronym right?
Yeah.
So we're essentially
The
assuming.
American Rescue Plan.
Yes. So we're assuming that those will not come to a cost against our general fund budget. So if you sum everything up, subtract all the ponds, we equate to around 1.95 million. So that's where we ended up. Now, you'll notice that the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are still at the top. But then we took the ones that we felt were those projects with the head director's discretion that moved to the top of these right here. So G12, that's crosswalk and ADA ramp installation, that is at Rose Canyon, or excuse me.
Rose Canyon Road and.
It's Ivy Farm, it's out,
Yeah, that's right.
it's the crosswalk for the
Yeah.
kids who get to school at Butterfield Canyon. It's outside.
Yeah, so that's actually Ivy Farms and Rose Canyon Road. So we're just essentially moving a mid-block out of the way of a driveway and making that work a little better. And then
Safer.
G14 is,
Like bingo.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
Actually, I feel like we're playing Battleship right now.
Miss.
Kinda hit. Then there's the Hawk pedestrian traffic signal intersection Rosecrest and Highfield Road.
so
G14.
needed. So needed right there. Oh my God.
And then, crosswalk and RRFB installation at Juniper Crest and Tilton Drive. That's along Juniper Crest. And then the cemetery restroom facility, which, has been on the list for a while. Thought that would be a good community use benefit and a legacy project as well. And so when you, again,
Would have been worth it just for the memorial
Right?
presentation.
it'd be nice to have it done before the last breakfast.
Yep.
And so that's essentially where we ended up with our proposal. Again, so there's the sheet you have in your staff report. And I really left this presentation pretty short,
So this is for,
and I figure I leave that up for discussion and questions.
so all 10 of
Happy
those.
to adjust.
Or 12.
The alternatives on there were essentially, we're happy to move and adjust at your discretion. But anyway, this is what we would propose.
Projects that we would.
Can I don't wanna do propose work that's unnecessary, right? But with potential, you know, legislation pending for other capital projects, you know, infrastructure bills and at the federal level, things like that. There could potentially be additional funds available for other projects. Does our priority list extend beyond here, and have we
That was my next
prioritized the
question, yeah.
remaining ones so that if there are additional funds, we just know what the next ones are?
Sounds like the scores of what you had initially remained the same, so those that we're not seeing now are still, would fall right into line, with the exception of these
Is the
that moved
next
up.
one G9, or is there another project?
That's what I would propose, and that's a good point,
Right, and
I'm
I'm
not
okay.
And that's fine, I just want, I'd like the full list prioritized, so that if magic money shows up somewhere, we know what the next one on the list is to do for this year, and then next year, when a whole bunch of these are gone, we come back, reweigh them, look at this, you know, priority list and start over.
So that's a good point, Steve. What we did is we prioritized enough to get into that $2 million mark, and then, you know, we essentially left it to the scoring after that,
Got
the
it.
baseline. And maybe it's an exercise that once it happens, we could come to council and say, hey, this happened, and we can shift this around, what do you guys think?
Let's do that.
That's something maybe we could.
I'll say,
Good
I
solution.
appreciate the effort that went into this. I feel much better about seeing this and seeing this process gone through and seeing that we're not just leaving things at the bottom of the list just because they're at the bottom of the list and they don't necessarily affect it. Does G1 need to get done? Absolutely, and I'm glad it's still at the top of the list. It absolutely needs to get done. But I also like to see that I was hoping to see jousting between the directors, but I'm glad that you guys came to an agreement.
They were jousting.
That actually happened before the official jousting
Okay.
past weekend.
Well, that's
Those
what
are
that
the
was.
ones in the suits of armor beating
They,
each
they just had
other.
their, okay.
No one won, we finally did paper, rock, scissors.
Just intimidate.
They
That's
kept
all we
missing
just
each
gave
other
up.
with the joust, nobody can hit.
But in all honesty, I'm looking at these projects and going, okay, yeah, I can see the value of all of these. I can see that the time and effort was made to protect the safety of our community, but also protect the needs of our community. Because to me, sanitation at a cemetery is a public safety issue. So I like this list, and I don't have. I'm much more comfortable with it, in my opinion. I don't know, what are you guys' thoughts?
Pretty good with it.
I would agree. I know we've all gotten calls from people in our district asking about certain projects. Why isn't this one being done? Why isn't that being done? And I appreciate that I can address it with those residents saying, there's a process that was gone through, a list of priorities were decided. These are some of the criteria that were done. Some minor adjustments were made based on, you know, each department's input. But generally speaking, it followed this priority list, and we only have so much money, it only goes so far. Next year, hopefully, we'll be able to, you know, get farther down the list, so
These are some good projects, though.
these are good projects.
It's a lot of work.
Those detention ponds, you know how many people are gonna be excited about those being done? Wow.
All right, any further discussion on this item? You got your direction, it sounds like? Move forward? Awesome. Thank you, great job. You're having like a stellar day today.
Yeah,
You got,
I asked Tammy for a cake and then nothing.
you got your engineering standards that you've been working on for like 4 years done, you got this done, I mean,
Can't be for a cake.
I'm impressed. All right, we're gonna move on to 4, which is our annexation area updates. I appreciate all the council's input earlier during our committee reports. I think this is more of where we'll do this in the future, is during this time. But the same kind of information passed on. But the good news is that means we don't have to do some of those now. So let's talk, if we want to go over, did we have any
I prepared a
information?
staff report, Mayor.
Yes, thank you.
I can kind of kick it off if you
Yes,
like.
please.
The only thing about doing them in their regular work meeting too is that more public.
Oh, I think it's entirely appropriate to have conversations involved. More specific details, I think this is more appropriate, but as far as a general overview of what happened, I think we should continue that. I absolutely agree. Sorry, go ahead.
So I just wanted to highlight what meetings have been held since the last time we met. I've asked each of the unofficial chairs of those committees or those working groups to just give a brief update of what has been discussed. And if that then leads to it, we can have additional discussion by council members that were present at those, and then have questions by any council members who were not present, who might want some additional information to kind of spark a discussion that would lead to additional direction for those working groups as they meet. So on May 27th, we had an infrastructure working group meeting. That was shortly after our 26th. We had a council meeting on the 26th. We had an infrastructure meeting the very next day. On June 1st, we had a parks, trails, and open space discussion. This wasn't a working group. This was a technical group that kind of spawned off from some of these groups that had more subject matter experts. Didn't have council members present, didn't have developer representatives present. It was more to just really hammer in on some of the technical items of the planning of a project of this size. All of that discussion comes back to the working group meeting, which you'll see happened on the second. So the very next day, the planning working group met on the second, talked a lot about those items, as well as the design guidelines of the potential project. June 1st, there was also an infrastructure technical group meeting, again, very technical, as the name suggests. Jonathan referred to it as the nerd group, I think.
It's
Yeah.
painful.
Yeah,
All the engineers love it, but
it was a group full of engineers, a room full of engineers, so, on the second, however, they actually came back with drawings and additional specs and those types of things that they had discussed, that were then discussed at the working group.
there is a further conversation to have about that meeting, public versus private road thing that we need to talk about. So we can-
Jonathan's actually gonna talk about that, I believe, in the next.
Yeah, right after.
Okay.
The next item. So June 2nd, we had those two meetings, and then on June 4th, there was a finance working group meeting that Steve highlighted in his council member report, that we can touch on again here after some of the other groups have had a chance to highlight what they discussed. So I've asked Jonathan and who else did I ask on this one? I asked Jonathan, yeah, to give us
It's
kind of just.
Jonathan Day.
Yeah, it is Jonathan Day. I've asked Jonathan just to give us a brief update on some of the infrastructure items. And you'll talk more about it in the next
I
agenda.
will, yeah, and if it's okay, I might tag team this with Justin,
Yeah,
if that's
that's
alright.
right, I'll
I
talk to you,
think
Justin.
that for the lion's share of our discussion, it's been primarily centered around transportation and roadways and the design criteria and how it pertains to roadways. We've even talked about what these sections are going to look like, what's the developer's intent, and will it work well with the Harriman City standards. And
Real quick, just for, cause I know the public's paying attention.
Yeah.
Can you say what a road section is, just so the people that don't know what we're talking about know what that is?
yeah, so it's the roadway cross section this way, not this way, right? So we're talking it, you go sidewalk.
If you were gonna cross the street, looking across the street, you cut it down the middle and turn it on its side, that's what you'd be looking at.
That's correct.
That's what you'd be looking
Yeah, so when you move from the outside in, you go from the sidewalk, this is a conventional one, right? Sidewalk, park strip, curb gutter, asphalt, curb gutter, park strip, sidewalk. So we discussed what those widths should look like, and it's widely surrounding, what drives the need for these widths and whatnot. So a lot of that discussion has been had, and it's a lot around what is a system improvement and what is a project improvement, and we're trying to get to that. The project versus system improvement, that also pertains to also water and storm drain system as well. And we've kind of been infusing that with our active transportation master plan as well. There's a lot of ground that still needs to be gained, I would think, on our utility side of things, but we've gained a lot of ground on the roadway. Justin, anything you wanna add or subtract?
For the most part, like you said, the roadways, there were some adjustments last week. We thought we were getting pretty close. There were some adjustments the developer wanted to make last week. We'll discuss those tomorrow morning. We met again today as a technical group.
What kind of adjustments were they looking to make?
So they were mostly looking at, it's not necessarily adjusting the road width, it's more those outside treatments, park strips and sidewalk widths and those types of things. So
But the road width, it's curb to curb, generally
Curb to
remain the
curb.
same.
Yeah, those ones are gonna remain the same, like Jonathan alluded to, those are mostly due to traffic counts and what it's basically, so. Those haven't really changed, it's just those outside treatments. I think we've come a long ways and I think we're very close, I think we're supposed to have them done by June 14th, and I think tomorrow in our meeting, we'll be there. Barring the discussion we have on the private road sections tonight, so.
The water is also pretty well laid out.
So the water is,
Gotta
the
get
water
that
is
together.
very well laid out. We have, the water is gonna be, I don't wanna say simple. But compared to roadways and what those look like, it's much different for water. Obviously, we have more defined guidelines as far as how much water we need to supply to residents and those things. And it's more on demand than it is anything else. So the biggest key is taking their water master plan, comparing it to what our master plan says, seeing if there's any discrepancies there, and then we should apply those capital projects and determine the funds and the cost of those.
So new water tanks, that kind of stuff.
Water tanks, pump stations, pipeline sizes, those
Does
types of
that, did that plan include, secondary water?
It does.
And are all the residential sites, properties essentially going to be provided with secondary?
So in our standards, it calls for any lot size smaller than 6,500, not any lot size. So if you have a subdivision and the average lot size of that subdivision is smaller than 6,500, you don't require secondary water. There comes a point where the cost benefit,
Yeah,
doesn't.
per unit, yeah.
Yeah, because we have infrastructure costs and capital cost to install that, it doesn't weigh, so.
But the like for the properties that have HOAs, like are those required?
Open space, like townhomes, apartment complexes, parks, park strips along roadways, those types of things will have secondary water, but those individual small houses.
And I can live with that.
And I found it interesting too, my inner nerd part was, playing this. Discussions about, if we're saying our plan is that there's an 8-inch pipe, but because of impact, there needs to be a 10-inch pipe, we're ascribing the upsize in pipe cost to them, right? Not just the regular pipe. So it's interesting what are already inside the city projects versus how Olympia Hills would impact those projects and the difference and how, on each thing, a pipe, a roadway, stormwater, every little difference has to be calculated so that we understand what those costs are really gonna be. See how I was nerding out too? I learned lingo, MS4, LED, it's good stuff, man.
Right.
I'll take my glasses, it'll be good.
So I'll touch on the finance, well, I'll have Alan too. One of the things we talked about, and you'll probably bring this up, Alan, and say it better than I can, but obviously these things that Justin and Jonathan have presented and that working group for the infrastructure group has really been looking at is trying to identify what those needs are going to be and then ascribe costs to that. And that will be pivotal for the finance working group to come in and say, all right, to Steve's point that he made in the general meeting, what are the priorities gonna be for these needs that we have, right? And then ascribing costs and figuring out a way to finance those.
So is that a discussion we need to have now, or is that just a discussion we need to be prepared to have later?
We need to be prepared to have it later. What do you think, Alan? I don't know what your
So
preference
far,
are.
we've just been talking more philosophically about, what direction we wanna go and why. When you look at this particular developer, if he had gone into the county as he originally planned, his structure was for 6 bids. One for each phase of the project, okay? That's what's approved by the county right now.
For 100 million
Yeah, for 100 million
One.
Total or each?
total.
total, which is interesting because the total cost of capital improvements is estimated about 300 million. So they're only talking about financing through the pit about a third of it.
Well, not all of the improvements are public improvements
Right.
either, so, they've gotta do their own development improvements, but, we're, as was mentioned in the other meeting, we're looking at a lot of different options of how to do this, and it might end up that it's a combination of several of them before we're done. But until Jonathan's infrastructure group gets to the point that we know real dollars of what the public infrastructure is, to actually put a plan in place for one of them is probably premature. So right now, our meetings have been about which one we prefer, and I think everyone's kind of drawing to the one they like as we move through it, but,
What's the,
Well, it depends.
yeah,
That seems to be the answer for a lot of things, right? Well, it
It's my
depends,
favorite
it depends.
answer.
That's my answer for a lot. It's the one answer I learned in grad school is the answer to everything is it depends, right? But for example, if the council's generally been, not generally, specifically expressed a lack of interest in looking at PIDs for residential development, right? And we've had some strong discussions about
But
that.
specifically the question I'm asking right now is
Right.
is that.
So if that's kind of in the background, I would say. That's not really the primary discussion. The primary discussion is whether it should be impact fees or perhaps a contract fee, right? That's kind of where most of the discussion has been. But the interesting question came up is our residents have talked about repeatedly, they want infrastructure improvements to precede development.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, because Jared made this point, is that with something like a PID, there's an opportunity to get a lot of that infrastructure done early. You don't have to wait for all the development to be done to get that infrastructure done. But it's important to understand that most of that is infrastructure inside of a new project. And some infrastructure improvements outside of the project, right, for other intersections around the city. Which would be good, like, we'd love to have those, but the major choke points in our city at Mountain View and Bangor and stuff, this doesn't touch that. And it doesn't provide an east-west freeway, and it doesn't provide, completion of all the freeway interchanges, and it doesn't do all that stuff. And so there's still this disconnect between a lot of new development adding to the choke points that already exist. So do we say we don't want to get as much infrastructure done as we can? We're willing to put it off for 5 or 8 or 10 years and do it in pieces? And do it through a traditional, impact fee / contract fee model? Or is there, is it in our residents' interest and their priorities to have that stuff done up front? And so if it is that way, the contract fee doesn't do that, but a PID does. But if we are against PIDs for other reasons, then we have to go the other way. Does that make sense? So it depends.
there's one more option, and it was, and we talked about it the other
I see.
day, and that's, doing a special assessment area and a special assessment area bond. Now, as was mentioned, there's positives and negatives to everything you do. This option is my favorite one. However, the property owners would have to consent to having their property become, having a
Pledge to security.
incentive on it. And so, that's the fourth option that we've talked about so far.
and are the property owners even willing to consider that at this point?
We got feedback that they weren't.
That's the question, yeah.
The developer says, I'm sure they would never do it, but they've never been approached about
That's
it
true.
either. This is just we don't think they would, but,
Well, it
It's
was their
fair.
attorney's
Yeah.
suggestion.
yeah, it was their
That's why
attorney
it's
that
all
wanted to do it.
It's a theoretical exercise
Yeah.
at this point, right?
It
But-
is.
But the question comes is, and again, should we have to be prepared to answer this question is it in our interest to reconsider a PID? And this is just conjecture, right? As a possible mechanism for funding some of the infrastructure, and it doesn't have to be all of it, it can be some of it. To meet what our residents have been voicing as a demand, or is that off the table and we need to find another way to do that and then, fight the priority list? I didn't know the answer, but I at least have some different questions than I've had about PIDs in the past that maybe want to try and at least look into those answers a little bit. So I don't have any feedback or information to provide the council in regards to that, but it did make me pause and reconsider our position on that. Not saying that we should, not advocating that we should. I just don't like taking options off the table if they might be in our residents' best interest and align with what their priorities are. So that's,
My feedback on that is I'm currently open to all of those options. Not saying that one is right or the same, not one is right, not one is wrong. I'm open to them all.
I still
to
think
see
we're
what works.
generally,
We're not there yet,
we're not real happy about PIDs, you know, and I expressed that,
particularly on residential.
I expressed that to
Yeah.
them explicitly in that meeting. If you bring that to the council, it is likely to get voted down. I'm not encouraging you to pursue that in any way. I mean, we're very clear about that, so.
But to your point, Steve, I think that there's reason to ask a few deeper questions as it relates potentially to this project and again, the concerns we've had. Maybe it's not all of it, maybe it's, I think it warrants.
Before we kill it entirely,
It warrants further investigation.
Hey,
Yep.
this is
That's,
Jared.
I'm just
I've
off for that
got
as a
some
thought.
comments for you.
We talked also in that meeting about the capital facilities plan, and to make that move forward. Alan, I don't know if I think you and Blake and JB were talking about it yesterday afternoon. What did we get to on that?
Well, that was part of what we talked about in our meeting the other day, is that without a capital facilities plan, we can't move forward really on any one of the four areas. We need the capital facilities plan that outlines what the ask is. And then we can figure out which way it works. And so, you know, we've been looking at it, and it's probably gonna be $80,000 total to do roads, stormwater,
To update all
water,
those.
to do all of them. So that's probably
It's coming.
will be asked.
Jared, did you have any input on that particular?
Yeah, can you not hear me?
We can barely hear you.
Can we turn him up?
Hold on a second.
back there, Jackie.
I don't know what to do.
Oh,
There you
there,
go.
we can hear you now.
Can't do it through there, you gotta. Is it,
Hello?
Turned up on the wall, Jackie.
It's not the wall, it's gotta go through the GoTo.
Oh, it does.
He's not logged into the room.
So we could give it a shot, Jared. We can barely hear you, but give it a shot.
I just wanna address the infrastructure, comment. At least for me, PIDs are definitely off the table for residential. I don't see how it makes any sense because it is for just the surface roads in the project. Right? What people are upset about when we refer to infrastructure and the impact of development on infrastructure are the roads downstream, the compounding effect downstream. And no matter how you fund the infrastructure inside the project, none of that affects what people want to see finished downstream. Does that make sense? It doesn't matter if you do it through a PID, contract fee, impact fee, like those surface streets get built with the development itself. People aren't saying, geez, I'm mad that, the road, the end of this cul-de-sac isn't finished because there's no houses there yet. They're saying that Main Street intersection is really dangerous and frustrating now that there's, 2,000 cars driving down there versus 100 a year ago. Those are the things that need to be taken care of. We look at other aspects of the development with employment centers, commercial, et cetera. I think we're open to PID and everything else. But for residential, I don't see how it makes sense. And there seems to be this blurring of the line when we refer to infrastructure, that residents want to see infrastructure first. But they want to see the infrastructure improvements done in the areas that new development has that compounding effect on.
yeah, and Jared, and I tried to make that point earlier, exactly what you were just saying, that the impact fees collected from Olympia Hills don't improve intersections on Bangerter, or don't provide connectivity on Mountain View Corridor, and don't do 111, and, that.
Need a PID.
Yeah, exactly. None of that will do it. The only thing that Olympia Hills would pay for is its proportional impact on things in our city and then its own infrastructure, right? So the question is, I think around the proportional impact on the rest of the city, how long it should take to collect the fees to pay for that. That's where the consideration of a PID has merit for consideration. I'm not saying that I'm advocating or supporting it, but if it would be a Main Street intersection, if it would be, 134th and, something, or 64th West, or whatever, where these tie-ins where it happens inside of our city, I think there's an argument to be made that there's a reason to do those sooner than later. And I think our residents would like to see those sooner than later. That's not a cul-de-sac in the development, that's a major intersection in our city, so.
Those improvements outside of the boundaries, are you saying that those are gonna be included in the impact fees? Because typically they're not. Only.
The proportionate impact would be included in there.
So Olympia Hills will have, in their development agreement with the county, they have to pay, there's that wording, they have to pay, but it doesn't say from what source. And at least traditionally, I don't know if it's even possible, maybe somebody can speak to that, that you're not gonna charge an increased impact fee on that area for its effect downstream. I think you probably should, because that's what happened, but I don't know if somebody can speak to that if that's possible.
So when you do an impact fee study, you take all of the future projects needed based on the travel demand for everything. And if you do one entire service area for the city, which we have, then you spread it out. So, but you can only charge for the things that are anticipated to be done in the next 10 years in phase one. So if there is a downstream project that's like widening an intersection
Years from now.
that is in the next 5 years, you can throw it in there and it's calculated in it, spread across the entire city's anticipated development. But the other flip side to that is the study might say, well, the new growth only attributes to 50% of the need. So 50% of that goes into your impact fee calculation, and 50% of it has to come out of general funds.
Stuff to come out of general fund.
And so that's where we've continually with our impact fee ran into issues, is if you're not updating it every year or every other year, you're building stuff and not keeping up with the
Cost of the impact.
cost there. And so you're losing money, or losing an opportunity for revenue and impact fees to pay for it.
Which is an argument why a contract fee with, we propose even an annual analysis to see if it needs to be increased or potentially decreased based on what the cost of infrastructure has been over the past year, right? It gives us an ability to adjust faster.
Another concept to think about is if you come in and build infrastructure earlier, you get what's called buy-in. And so if you have, like Harriman Boulevard, we've continually captured buy-in capacity in our impact fee studies and say, well, there's X amount of capacity, but we're only using 20 or 30% of it, so 70% of this is future, is we paid for future growth, so we can apply that cost, as long as we have invoices of what we paid for, into the calculation, and then that can get, so stuff that's already built can actually be paid for with
Be
impact
paid
fees,
back
if it
forward.
was built
Yeah.
oversized. And so, it's pretty complicated when you get into it, but it still never seems to be,
It's never enough.
it's never enough, because there's so many rules and restrictions on how much you can apply to it and percentages.
Yeah, that's why,
Is that where this contract fee really comes in into its
that's
own?
really where it comes in, and
Or are we talking about the time
impact
limits?
fees can only be applied to certain aspects, whereas a contract fee could be applied to some extra aspects of it, right?
And we
Some,
would- and I'm-
some extra
So-
improvements on park strips or some things like that. that
So
normally
my
impact fee
understanding
would be.
of this conversation we're having is the contract fee would be in place of the impact fees.
Yes.
And they would start based on what the impact fee would have been, and then, and based on what additional things that are needed to be
Yep.
included, we would increase over that based on
That's
that
exactly right.
articular, I can't speak, the things that can be articulated in that development agreement.
Yep.
So,
It'll be
but
in these, capital facility plans we put
I'm
together.
also interested to look at the special assessment area and how it can address these things.
So I have a couple of comments on it. PID, my primary concern again, has always been in a residential area, is the increase of home ownership to whoever owns those homes. We're already talking about an area where they're gonna pay a lot more in transportation costs, cause they're way away from anything. An area that's gonna be much higher in their water bills because they're gonna annex in on tier two water. And then if you add more taxation on them through a PID, that, again, it just goes to this increased cost of homeownership, which I am concerned about. The contract fee makes sense, but my concern is that we're using it to fix problems that we didn't have enough money to pay for, and so we get further down the road, and we've used the contract money to cover the gap, what the impact fees won't pay in areas that we needed it to cover. And so then, 15 years down the road, all of a sudden we have a gap again because we've used contract fees where we didn't cover the gap before.
I'm not sure I understand that, cause
Well, right now we can't afford to upgrade an intersection because we didn't have enough money or we're short on it. So we're waiting. We have a whole list of capital facilities, capital projects that need done. And a lot of it is because, I'm finishing. A lot of it is because I've heard this constantly, well, impact fees never cover it all, and I've heard a few different times in different meetings, it's because, well, we weren't charging the right amount of impact fees because councils before you decided not to charge the full impact fees. So there's been a history of failure to collect certain amounts of money. And so now we're in a deficit, and we need money to cover the costs. And so if you come to this point and you go, okay, this road only gets 50% of the impact fee money because only 50% of it's eligible, but you have to pay 100% of it. So if we use the contract fee money to do that, it just feels like we get backlogged on other projects, and we just further down the road we go, dang, we don't have enough money for this stuff now because we used all of our contract money here. The other point I would ask, this is exactly why I asked in the other meeting, to see the bigger picture, because right now, we're really focusing on exactly Olympic Hills, but we, in my mind, these infrastructure meetings should really help all of us understand, okay, what intersections are gonna fail, what's gonna have to happen here? And I'm not seeing that in the transportation or in the infrastructure meetings. I'm not saying you guys aren't having those conversations, I think you are. But I just think that the conversation needs to be broadened so we really understand this is gonna fail by this time, and here's the cost, here's what could be used as impact fee money, here's what couldn't. Those kind of things I think we really have to have a clear understanding of.
Yeah, and early on in our meetings, we did have an analysis, partial analysis of at least the Hales Engineering study that said it has every project in and then project plus, and it says when those things need to be done at what time, and so there's at least a structure for that conversation to be had, right?
And that's why I said that, because I know it's not gonna reinvent the wheel to do it. We have the data, we just need to make sure that that's getting plugged in for every single.
You'll see something in the next week or so too from the Bonneville study, their A-Trans group.
Yeah.
They sent over a draft with some corrections that need to be done, but they have some really good maps that do a really good comparison of here's what it is with, at Olympic Hills, here's the traffic with Olympic Hills. We can see the delta between the two at all the intersections
That'd be really
and
good.
segments of roads.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's really beneficial, because then we can start understanding the true impact and the financial impact to some degree, what it would be versus impact fees, not eligible, that kind of stuff.
We'll probably pull those maps out for the infrastructure meeting tomorrow, so you'll get to see them then. And
Perfect.
then we'll include them in the minutes, cause I think the exhibits were rock solid. There were just some paragraphs that were kinda hard to
Yeah.
get through, so.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'll just say this, cause I know everybody's interested in finishing this meeting sooner than later, so.
It's only 9:00, come on, we got hours.
But I've kinda had this, I don't know, epiphany around impact fees, lately, trying to understand them and how they work, and, one of the things about impact fees that's really interesting is that you have to, it's new growth that pays for infrastructure. You can't, afford to build new roads just for the sake of building new roads. New roads facilitate new developments. New roads facilitate new businesses. New roads facilitate new schools, right? It's all attached to new growth driving infrastructure being built. The really stupid things about impact fees, the legislature needs to fix this, but this idea that you can only collect impact fees for stuff that's gonna happen over the next certain number of years, and then when you get that, you have to pay for it within a certain number of years. But some of those projects, the horizons are so long before they're finished. I mean, the impact fees have been paid on 10 other projects before that one even comes due, right? So there is a lot of this money from current development is being used to pay holes for previous development. It is just the nature of a growing city. I don't know that there's anything wrong or has been, misappropriated or funds haven't been used appropriately. I think that's just the nature of the beast.
It's the situation we've been put in by the legislature.
Right.
Yeah, some,
And so-
there was definitely funds appropriated, discussed in a few meetings. Not by this council, but a while
Right,
ago.
you're
And not
right.
by the staff, by decisions made a long time.
By council, right, and not collecting full impact fees, I mean, all kinds of strangeness, right? And maybe they had good reasons at the time for doing it that way, we don't know, right? But we can look back in hindsight and go, that probably wasn't the right decision to make. The interesting idea is how do we complete building infrastructure in the absence of new growth, right? I think that's a question that would be awesome to answer and say, well, if we never built another house in Harriman, is all the infrastructure built that we need to support everybody that's already in Harriman? I don't think it
So
is.
that's commercial development, that's how we pay for that, is by getting enough tax revenue and stuff in here to keep up with that O and M, replacing roads, those kind of things, that's the idea behind commercial
Yeah,
development.
but that, again, commercial is still, some of it's infill, right? But some of it is new development too, right? And you have to build new roads, you have to build, look, just the road there at Academy Village, right? Improvements, stuff have to happen all the time. So it is an interesting problem with the way that public infrastructure is financed, that it just is this constant,
Shortfall?
yeah, it's like built into the system, right? And the question is, what decisions could we make about not only Olympia Hills, but other land out there and how it gets annexed? And plans for how those funds are used to try and minimize those shortfalls. Like, how do we use the money so that we don't take shortfall, say, okay, we're gonna fix all the shortfalls in the city, and now we have all these shortfalls in Olympia Hills, right? And then we're pushing it on. I'd rather try and say, let's figure out what happens in Olympia Hills and West and get that working as close to, limit those holes as much as possible. And then as we infill with commercial development, as we infill those things, we should be able to catch up on inside the city infrastructure things that we still need to finish up. Is that a fair statement? I mean, it's just, I hate impact fees. The more I learn about them, I just don't understand how cities ever get built, man. It's like
So
voodoo.
I think the old way of doing it, I've worked for smaller cities where they've done pioneering agreements. And those are not very advisable, but I think that's where impact fees were born out of, is the guy would own a field, to get it developed, and have a pioneering agreement signed with the city that would build this road the size you want it, so the guy or the person next to me can develop his property someday. That one came in, and the city imposed a fee on them to pay the first person back for the road they built. And I don't think anyone liked it. It was hard to remember, they got lost, so the impact.
I think they did that on 3300 with the gas.
Extension agreements.
And,
Yeah.
yeah, so I know there was one a couple years ago in Farmington where the school came in and they required all the residents that lived along there to honor that pioneering agreement and pay for the sidewalk the school built in front of it. And these people had to come up with $13,000, $14,000, $15,000 for sidewalk in front of their homes, which, so impact fees work better than that, but all the restrictions over the years that we put on them make it really hard to actually pay for the infrastructure, make it work, and then you end up with, like you said, paying the impact fees paid on this project, pay for something that we have an agreement to pay back that was signed 10 years ago.
Yes.
And I think Steve hit it right on the head where let's do it right here moving forward so that it's not,
Let's do it better.
let's do it better in this, so that this works. We can try to, we will fix the others. Like, it's not just try, we have to. We will fix those over time. But we don't wanna create new problems, just like Sherry says, that we don't wanna take
Rob
money
Peter
here
to pay Paul, yeah.
and do that. I think that's a valid point, and I absolutely agree with 100% that we shouldn't be doing that. We should be making this right, making this a what I wanna see is I wanna see 10 years from now, every city in the state of Utah going, wow, Harriman figured out how to do that right, and we should all follow the plan that they did. And I think we're on our way there. It's just continuing this process. So I'm hopeful with what we've heard so far, at least in regards to finance.
So not to hijack the meeting, cause I feel like I've been talking a lot here, but there is this road cross-section thing we need to get to.
Well,
And it
we,
kinda ties into all the work groups and the finance and everything else.
so, I mean, we can talk about that now, but we'd still have things, I know we have things to talk about in the planning group as well.
I just had the planning group left, and I've asked Michael just to kind of fill us in on where they're at with things. And obviously Mayor and Clint, who were also in those meetings, to add anything.
So when Olympia Hills was approved by the county, their consulting team worked with the county very closely, and they modeled their design guidelines off of what's called a form-based code. This was a template that was produced by Wasatch Front Regional Council about 7 or 8 years ago. And it has a lot of good high-level design guidelines and standards. But it was missing some details that were to come later. Not all of the development standards were approved and decided by the county at the level of approval they had already received. So we began looking at what we could possibly either insert or reference to city code and use existing city codes. I had some concern with that in that we often have challenges where we are using the MDA kind of as a pseudo legislative, standard in addition to our base zones. And then over time, those standards change and it just becomes a very difficult thing to administrate because we're always having to look at different historic codes for what was applicable at the time of approval and things. So we talked with the development partner about the idea of creating, again, a comprehensive tool. And I think maybe in partnership with that came this new zoning tool that we talked about earlier tonight. Trying to see if we can create a comprehensive single source of standards, including the design guidelines. So we've been working on that. I think the development team has been focusing more heavily on residential standards. They did introduce to us I think it was last week, some commercial signage, for example. That was a new short chapter that they added. But our current draft is still needing more. It really doesn't have a lot of commercial design standards in it. It has uses, it has heights, it has setbacks. It doesn't really have any kind of architectural design guidelines for commercial uses. So that's where we're at. We are currently doing a Bluebeam review on their second draft of the design guidelines. We have another team meeting tomorrow morning, just briefly. And then I think we're wrapping up our red line reviews tomorrow. And we're going to consolidate all of those comments and forward it back to the development team for their response.
There were a couple of things specifically that I think the council would wanna be aware of in regards to design standards. One request that we got was in regards to materials. Can you speak to the wanting to just go with one material?
Well, the current draft talks about having 3 architectural features. Doesn't really define what those architectural features are. That's one of the things that's in our red line. But there was this idea of sometimes you can see a very successful design that's actually pretty limited on variety. And we can all think of some good examples where perhaps a building is all stucco because that is consistent with the type of architectural detail or pattern. For example, if it's a southwestern style architecture. So not you don't necessarily achieve high quality design by just simply ensuring that you have multiple building materials. So this is still something that we're working through. Another issue that came up, Mayor, and you reminded me of this, is that there's this idea of looking at setbacks between structures and not necessarily from property lines. I think this is another issue that they just introduced to us, I think it was last week, that we're gonna have a follow-up discussion on tomorrow. So
The reason I bring it up is because the request in the design guidelines that we saw was they wanted to allow a single building material. And their idea was, well, hardy board can be used 5 different ways, right? And it can look quite nice if you use, which is considered a stone material. It can look really nice, but if you only, it could only be hardy board and other stone materials, and that limits what they could or could not do. And so that was kind of the way it was phrased or requested.
And this is where we were talking about, you could have like a hardy board building, which is really popular right now with the farmhouse look. But then you also have, maybe you have cornice details, or you have architecturally definitive columns on the front of the building. That becomes an architectural detail. Yeah, so,
Elevation
yeah,
stuff or something,
yeah.
So that was just, one of the reasons I wanna bring that up is because I know that if you guys got that, if the entire council got that later and all you saw in that was one material, and we hadn't already addressed that or talked about that or given our opinions on that, which I don't necessarily do right now, there might be some, whoa, hold on, what are you talking about? So
I
that's.
think as we keep working through the red line draft and consolidate that, then obviously we can give those areas of
Some more attention.
call out, we can obviously pass on to everyone so that they know exactly what the discussion was centered around, where at least that draft language currently sits.
Another thing we've been doing is looking at how we administrate this architecture review process and doing something maybe new, where maybe there's a more of an independent review process. And that's still something we're negotiating or talking about at least, so.
I'm good.
Just to fill in a bit more on the commercial standards, I think they've got a good idea of what they wanna do. They keep talking about a theme that's gonna follow with the mine and kind of look like that. So I think we got a good basis to start from.
Yeah, and their signage program that they submitted to us with some illustrations reflect that.
Yeah, should be hard to get something included that.
Alright, so now I think it's time to move on to item 4.2, which is the proposed Olympia Road cross sections.
Who's gonna present that?
And just so many of you might start to hear, it sounds like they've changed the name of the project simply to Olympia. So it is, yes, they've changed the name to simply Olympia, so if you see that it says Olympia on our agendas or things, the name is slightly changed. Jonathan,
Ready. So while Mitch is helping me put this up, I wanted to add a little bit of background to this just a little bit. So as we've been reviewing the cross sections and their design standards, the cross sections of which they have proposed have essentially met the cross section requirements for arterial, collector, and local. And they would even add, I would say, if there was any really deviation, would be some additional open space or additional sidewalk for the most part.
Which one?
It's not a PowerPoint, it's just a PDF. I wonder, I could probably just email this to you right now.
Okay.
Which one is it?
It's the staff report.
Yeah, that's on here.
But, Jack, if you can do that, I'll just keep it.
I'll get it over.
Let me know if you can. I can get it to them. So, plus I have a lot of talking, well, I'll be quick, but anyway, so as we were talking through that, they wanted to propose some private roadway cross sections. And that conversation came up and we said, well, let's bring this to council. And so they had 3 private roadway cross sections that they want the council to kind of take a look at, since we somewhat flagged that as we call these pink flags. These are items that we want to bring to the attention of the group to kind of take a look and review that. So before I do that, the three sections that they have, the first one essentially equals the roadway cross-section that's the minimum cross-section that Harriman has for their local. And that's
In our new engineering standard.
in our new and existing engineering standards. Oh, the existing ones, thanks. The epiphany just came to me. So this is their first one. That is equivalent to the 53-foot roadway cross-section, even though the right-of-way that you'll see here doesn't say 53. They just haven't added in these side treatments as part of it. So when I'm talking about these widths, I'm mostly speaking of curb gutter, asphalt, curb and gutter.
Back of curb to back of curb.
Back of curb to back. The second cross-section right here is essentially equivalent to what was proposed to the council as a minimum standard for private roadway cross-sections. Well, at least we had kind of gone back and forth when we discussed that, which is a 26-foot minimum drivable width, which the Harriman City Standard is 32, right? So that's what this second section is reflective of. Again, it's what was proposed a little while back. This third one right here is a 20-foot wide drivable width, which is probably equivalent to what we have in our standards, equal to an alley. And I'm going to talk about that just a little bit. What I also wanted to do is summarize, because it's relevant to the conversation, the UFA requirements as it pertains to roadway cross-sections. And we've kind of gone through that, and I think it's important for this. So, going from smallest to biggest, anything between 20 feet width, so 20 feet drivable width is the absolute minimum width that UFA will allow. And the restrictions on that is you can't have any parking on both sides and no utility can be in there. So those are the requirements for anywhere between 20 and 26. Now once you hit 26 and up to 32, the requirement then is that you have to have no parking on one side, posted on one side. But you can have a fire hydrant.
Aren't you required to have a fire hydrant?
It's not required to have a hydrant, it can have a fire hydrant. And that difference, the reason for that is if an engine comes, they can put their riggers down, it's wide enough, they can grab it onto a hydrant. And then at 32 feet, so this is at 32 feet, which is representative of this one. Again, it's equal to our smallest roadway cross section. You can have parking on both sides. You can allow, so the parking is unrestricted essentially, and obviously you can have hydrants on it. So, let's see. Oh yeah, and then my last item I wanted to give, again I'm trying to summarize this because I want this to be a conversation, I just want to give perspective. The last item here, in talking with the developer's representative, the intention of, and Mitch, I'm wondering, is it possible you can zoom in on that third roadway cross section? If not, it's okay, I can explain it. But again, it's 20 feet drivable width from front of curb face to front of curb face. And the intention, from what our understanding is in conversation earlier today with the developer, is that they intend for this roadway to essentially be a feeder to other alleys, if that makes sense. So that is the purpose and intention of this roadway cross section. Now, of course, they can't have a utility in it, but it's essentially intended for that roadway to feed to other alleys, just in
When you say utility, they can't have a fire hydrant.
You can't have a fire hydrant, thank you.
You can have other utilities.
You can have
You-
sewer.
things we
You can
normally have
a
in
water
the-
line in it, you
Yeah.
just can't have a fire hydrant.
Those are the points that I just thought I would add before I wanted to lead this to conversation or as a discussion. Again, the first one, it meets the minimum local. The second one, it meets the original private roadway cross sections I had proposed a while back, but after discussion we backed off that. And then this third one here meets the minimum requirement for an alley and UFA requirement for an engine.
Another thing I just wanted to point out is, and this was in discussion at our last infrastructure meeting, is if we don't allow something less, there's really no incentive to do private, right? So that's why, and they have intentions of wanting to have private areas, HOAs in the development. And if we don't allow something in our typical road cross sections, there's really no incentive to do so. So,
We said that the whole time we were doing engineering standards, so, right?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about, right, is we said, you know, parking on one side but no structures on the other side, you know, and that kind of stuff. And then we get to this point where the rubber meets the road and you realize there's no private roads anywhere, right? And then the costs go way up, you know, for Olympia Hills, right? So, or for Olympia, I guess now. And so that was where this conversation came in is there a private road that's less than city standards, but is compliant in every way that still makes sense? Are we willing to consider that or not? And it's tough, man. It's tough. Some of these, the whole board was covered with YouTube, like 500 cross sections here. Of like, this would be an alley and this could be this lane and you have to have so many feet between fire hydrants and you could only have an alley this long and it became this issue of, first, is there ample driving space? Second, is there ample parking space? And then third, is there ample access to and from the homes, right? Do we have, you know, could you do this road, but you don't have any front access to any of the properties? Well, then you're gonna have parking all on the front, right? And you have a shorter place, maybe that's acceptable. But if you have homes on both, you could have homes with no front access on one side of the street and homes with front access on the other side of the street, so that people could park in their driveways here and park on the street on this side and still have a narrow roadway, but you know, in between those driveways, you wouldn't want any parking on that side. What they didn't want to do is create no parking signs every, you know, 30 feet up and down all the private roads to make it work. So I don't know, is that about what the concerns kind of were discussed around? It's whether or not the city wants to authorize private roads and have private roads be less stringent requirements than our other city roads.
And are we only talking in this discussion about curb to curb?
That's the emphasis essentially in, as I'm thinking about it. And so yes, Mayor, and I would add to that, and that's partially the reason why they've kind of let these out of the.
Cause in my opinion, that's the discussion, like,
Yep.
for my opinion, this is a curb to curb issue.
Right.
Because it's one, parking, and it's two, public safety.
Right.
And I'm gonna bring up the same things I bring up every time. I want fire trucks and ambulances to be able to get through in an emergency. And if we have people parking on roads that even, you know, that it's a private road, okay, it's a private road, but people still have to park their cars, they're gonna park on wherever they can figure out where to park it. We've now created public safety housing. And that is my biggest concern in regards to the cross sections.
Well, optional on sidewalks, are sidewalks optional, is that what you're saying, or the sides of the sidewalks are optional?
Cause that's another thing too, is that now you have people walking down a little 20-foot road too.
Exactly.
There's no sidewalk.
How big is that curb? Is that a 3-inch curb?
6-inch, you talked about the
Standard.
That's a standard curb,
Standard
sorry, that's
curb,
it's not one of those like fake curbs that they can kind of call a curb, but it's not really, it's really just one, yeah, okay.
and maybe, and I know I've kind of talked about it just a little bit, but I just want to emphasize, each one of these sections comply with the UFA requirements.
You did specify that, yes. I mean, I think I've made myself known on how I feel about private roads. I am more okay with adjustments on private roads on back of sidewalk to back of sidewalk than I am with the curb to curb. It's that drivable width that gives me more concern than almost anything else. And so when I look at a 20-foot, is that a 20-foot, the small one?
Yeah.
When I look at a 20-foot, that makes me really nervous because all it takes is one person parking in front of, because this would be an alley loaded product at this point. All it would take at that point is where I would expect they would use something like this, would be an alley loaded product. What I would see is one person parking in front of their garage sideways, which we see happen all the time. And now we have difficulties getting emergency vehicles or dump trucks, trash trucks or whatever through.
So one of the things where we could potentially allow that kind of a road to be used is if you had rear loading property on both sides of that street, then you get your problem, right? And you have to have no parking signs on one side. If you did front loading on one side and rear loading on the other side, you could potentially alleviate that concern with driveways that would allow for parking. And then visitors could park on the other side of the street, right? That's the only way I could see that working, because if you have two rear loaded properties, we got a problem. You could potentially do two front loading properties on that as well, and then you probably have even less on street parking,
well,
right?
But we've also, the example I've always brought up is front loading on both sides. It's the F-150s having to park out on the sidewalk as part of their driveway, because their driveway is only 18 feet
Well,
long.
then, again, that's a design guideline thing we have to put in, driveways
So-
that are
so-
default for that stuff, right?
So that's why I hesitate and I push back. Is this necessarily an entirely make or break situation for me? Probably not, okay? What I would ask is that as we're going through this process, that we make sure we focus on specifically that public safety issue and addressing how we make sure that fire trucks and ambulances and police vehicles are always ensured that they can get down those roads. If we can find a way to do whatever we need to do to make sure they have access, I'm much more comfortable with allowing for roads that might be smaller than our standards. That's my 2 cents.
One thing to clarify on that third cross section is if you did do rear load off both sides, we've in the last meeting minutes that were sent out, we talked about addressing. You'd have to address the house off of a street that it would front, because there would be no front door if it was rear loading.
Yep.
So then you would have a more traditional local street in front of this house without any driveways to allow parking on it. And then that would induce parking out in the front of the house, because the only thing on the backside is the garage door. No one's gonna park there and walk in.
Yes. And if that is something that we can write into the guidelines, that I'd be more willing, because we did talk about that in the design standards, about making sure that there's adequate parking on the front, and possibly doing bulb outs and whatever to make sure that that's made clear that's parking and that kind of stuff. And so I'd be more open to that, but how do we word it so that, because we've said part of what we're trying to do is make a lot of this administrative, right? So that once it's done and it's an administrative process so that it can move forward. I wanna make sure that we don't get in a situation where now, I guess technically it's an administrative issue and now we can't address it. That's my concern.
So there's one other thing that I expressed as a concern to them about this too, in that meeting, was the idea that the reason why we've been holding to these minimum standards is the idea that in the future HOAs may dissolve and then we get stuck with substandard roads, right?
Even if they dissolve, they just abandon it,
Right. So we had some talks about, special assessments on anybody that would wanna dissolve an HOA and make the city responsible, that kind of stuff, right? There's ways to do that, but I'd rather make sure that there's well thought out planning around these
Yes.
things so that we don't have those kind of problems and mistakes in the future, but you can see that, well, if you do it this way, then it goes this way. If you do this, it's this, and there's all these little if-thens and those kind of questions that come up. So, when you look at a 21-foot cross-section, that's kind of an undesirable road as it's been applied in other areas in our city, right? How could we apply a 1 foot drivable space, and what restrictions would we put on the development along that space that would make sense, so that it does become a functional road. And that's where these questions come up, it's like, I don't know, I'm sure our staff and their representatives can come up with some reasonable ideas and propose them to us, but man, we have to answer about 500 of these really hard questions to put this thing together.
Well,
you know?
as it was explained, as far as the small one, the third one there, in terms of it being a feeder for like an alley loaded product. And again, having at least my frame of reference, as Sherry just pointed out, is some of the product is over in Daybreak, obviously. And how they're utilized, but they're still addressed off of a road that runs in front of them.
Which is a nightmare to find them,
Yep,
by the way.
it is.
But again, in that context for me, knowing that, again, UFA has signed off to say, no, that's acceptable for us to do that, and that those become, again, really just a small road to get to that alley loaded product, that is, in my mind, a reasonable place to make that exception and to make it private, that is not a maintenance issue for the city. That's the simple answer to a very complex issue. There's a lot of other,
Right.
but ifs in there, type thing, but the simple answer on my part is in that context, I think that's an acceptable place to consider it.
Not preferable, right?
And that is, yeah, there's an acceptable, then there's also
Yeah,
what they would like, what they
80-foot
prefer.
wide roads
Yeah.
and plenty of space, it'd be great.
You'd like to be able to turn that wagon, or that 40
Yeah, it's the
calf
U-turn in the
wagon
middle of the
route.
street, right? But, I think that Blake's really good at this. He finds pictures of examples of these things, and seeing the drawing on the board, I can still see it in my mind, the way that alley load and all that stuff was being discussed. I think as we get to decision points on items like this, that having pictures for the council to look at and
That's
reference
very
these things is gonna be really, really helpful to say, this is an example, and here's some guidelines that apply to this, and this is some design standards that we've applied that would make this function, all that stuff, we really have to try and see that.
The pictures need to be pretty and ugly.
Yes, we
Right.
want to see both.
Well, if you can just send it to us in a picture and just have circle yes or no, then I'm good.
We're good.
So one thing to kind of think about is in the design standards, each roadway cross section, they don't necessarily look like that's only part of the one sheet for that roadway in the design standard. It actually also includes, here's a picture of where that makes sense potentially, and
Yeah.
maybe that's something that could be included in the design standards. We show where this lane is intended and appropriate.
Yes.
Maybe also where it would not be appropriate, for example, where, we're fully loaded both sides on whatever, like, I
Not to
don't-
be used for an arterial.
Not-
And
that would make sense, not to use that for an arterial, yes.
to put this in perspective for anybody in the public that's, why are we spending so much time talking about this road, is because if we can't accept a road like this, and they have to build it to the standards we do for the public roads that we're building, then there's no reason for them to build private roads in there, and thus every road in a development becomes public roads, and there's additional expense and maintenance and upkeep and all of those kind of things. So it drastically impacts the financial analysis that gets done, and if it would or wouldn't make, all those kind of things are vastly impacted, because it's miles and miles and miles and miles of asphalt that would have to be paid for and upkept by the city.
Right, which is, again, something that this whole process is supposed to analyze, the financial
Right.
analysis is to
Yep.
say, if we won't allow this type and it's all gonna be public roads,
Yep.
here's what the O and M is, here's what the cost is.
Right.
That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think good policy and good design has to be our primary concern. And the financial impacts of it precipitate from that rather than drive that, if that makes sense, right?
And I wanna make it clear here very publicly that I believe that the developer is working with this in good intent.
my concern is the third parties down the road that might be actually, taking a portion of this. We've seen it in the past, and that's why I'm concerned about it. I don't wanna see those same mistakes repeated. It's not that I don't think there's not a place for it. It's my concern of how severe it could become is what drives me to push back on it.
Well,
But
and
I
to
do
John-
think there's a good faith effort here.
To Jonathan's point, I think, again, part of that is here's the cross section, all of the details of it, and this is where we would think that this would be an option for
Yeah,
application.
this is where we would use it and
Yep.
the way it would be used.
Absolutely.
Just because I haven't been devil's advocate all night, and it also drastically reduces the
demonstrate.
number of units. But when you take out more and more space with roads, and so that's a deterrent to the developer, because obviously the idea is to put as many units as possible. So, again, I don't want that to be a driving point on our side, we have to look at this and say,
I agree.
if we want to just take a little field trip around to some of the developments in our own city that are like, get complaints a lot because they're a nightmare, we really should keep that in mind.
Here in the town center, we have almost like an alley streetscape, but we have homes up front on them. That's kinda like the worst of all situations.
And that goes exactly back to my point, is that's why I'm concerned, is we don't want to continue. It's the same thing that we talked about earlier, we wanna do it right, we don't wanna do it, and try to fill in we just wanna do it right moving forward, and I think there's a good faith effort to do it. That's where my concern is, so if we can build into the design guidelines or whatever, places where we can't, this is where we consider it. And this might be one of the things, I know that we wanna do a lot of administratively. Wouldn't this have to come back to planning commission through, for plat?
Well, and the design standards will need to go through planning commission. Is that correct, Mike?
Yeah, it'll be part of the MDA.
MDA.
But I'm talking about when the specific.
When
Every
the
subdivision would
specific
have to come
pod,
through.
yeah.
So it still have to come
Or
through
the
planning,
NRC.
But if they
that's my concern.
If they
Is-
choose it, is there an opportunity to say no to it? And it sounds like
And that's one of the things that
probably not.
I've been a little more focused on is if a plan is presented that's in compliance with the design
Should be an
guidelines,
administrative function.
it's, why are we taking it back to the planning
Right,
commission?
And this is one, and that's one of the concern, it's not that that's not right. But how do we keep that from becoming an issue of, cause
You do that through specificity in the
Yeah.
MDA.
And to your point, David, I think you said this earlier. I believe that the developers of Olympia
Absolutely.
have a good vision in their head
absolutely,
of how this would all look. And they have ideas about it's all supposed to go together and it all, but the problem is there's been kind of loopholes and other MDAs have been done, so when another developer finally comes in, they find a way to really alter the vision that was originally set up. And none of us want that. I don't think the developer wants that,
I don't
right?
think they do either.
Is this, and so I think they're very cooperative and collaborative on trying to find out how to make these things work. But the art of this, right, the science of this comes down in how do you memorialize this in the agreement to make sure that it doesn't take a left turn down the road unintentionally. That's the big fear, right, is unintended consequences or overlooked things. How do we tie those things down?
And that's really that's my biggest concern is, I mean, if parking is terrible, and that's something that I think we eat, right? Like, that's our mistake. It goes back to what happens when we put public safety at risk.
Yeah.
And that's
even worse.
And how do we ensure that we're reviewing that? And maybe we need to review it on a regular basis of what that particular alignment is, whatever. But how do we make sure that we don't say, we're setting up what the public safety is gonna be 20 years from now, when none of us will be here, most likely, and standards will have changed, technologies will have changed. Like, how do we ensure that we have enough flexibility long-term, that if something comes up, we can still address it, but still give them the assurance and flexibility?
if we can find that
Gotta
balance,
all of those kind of.
if we can find that balance, great. That's what I wanna do, is find that balance of how,
The skilled craftsmanship of our attorney.
but that's what I'm trying to get at, is that's what I need you to do.
And I have a thought on that already.
Okay,
Do you
good.
wanna hear it?
Yes, I do.
Intermittent reviews where both parties sit down and say, is this working well? Is this working the way we planned it? And you build that into the development agreement. Both parties meet every 3, every 5, every 7 years and look at all of the whole thing, the whole project, and make that determination. No one's under any obligation to make changes to the development agreement,
But they're
but
obligated
at
to come
least
sit
you're
down,
sitting
yeah.
down and saying, is this working the way we intended it to?
That makes me more comfortable. Especially if there's more ability to require that in regards to specifically public safety. In regards to private roads versus public roads, yeah, let's go start giving them that benefit.
And we
Public
also
safety
have
is
a
my concern.
built-in exception to vested rights within a development agreement for those things specifically. So if there's a public safety concern that comes up 5 years down the road, that
Has to be
conflicts,
trump a
that
vested
conflicts with the vested right under the development agreement, we can come into them and say, hey, you actually need to follow this, even though you've got this vested right under your development agreement.
And an
For this
example of
reason.
that would be under the Uniform Fire Code.
Right.
That if something significant changes in there as it relates to access, well, it's gonna be new construction, it has to comply with
Right.
whatever the new code is at the time when it comes to that, those vested rights don't give it, so.
And I know you are absolutely the one to talk to about this, cause this is your wheelhouse when it comes to access and fire and that kind of stuff, so I appreciate that insight. It's just, that's my concern, and
Absolutely.
that's why I
It's
wanna make
valid.
sure it's, I
One thing-
beat it to as
So you brought
much
this
as I
too,
can.
one thing that they did mention in that is their approach to over accommodating for parking. They kind of mentioned they wanna make sure that they're creating far more parking than would
They said
normally
that,
be, engineeringly standard established, so, boy, that was a terrible way of saying that. But I haven't seen the plans of that or how that would actually be accomplished, what their ideas are about accommodating additional parking. I'd like to see that come
And
to.
that would help me feel better about smaller roads, if there's a plan in place to address the parking need. Okay, yeah, then there's more reason to allow them that smaller road. So, and then it does become, like you said, if they're addressed off of a different road, and it's just about, then that does make a lot more sense, so.
And I can't be here for tomorrow's meeting.
I'm still stuck on engineeringly.
Engineering.
Engineers
Sure.
are making up words.
Trying to
Sure
explain
did.
all this to them and
I might have cut
get
you
them
off,
answers.
did you have something else to add? I apologize.
See, engineeringly threw her off too.
Engineeringly,
So does that give,
Oh, I was gonna say on the MDA, Chase did, in our discussion the other day, he did elaborate on those types of things, really. And in addition to what the state code is, cause they don't have a choice on the state code, it just has to happen. But my frustration is on our city codes, they don't have to, apply those. But if we can craft language in the agreement that would say if it's for, safety issue or something like that, then it has to be.
And my experience in executing these development agreements is that when you bring that up, most people are generally compliant anyways,
Sure.
voluntarily, without,
and we've seen that with the other MDAs too, as they've come in for making changes, they're amenable to updating to current city standards, right?
so what I would like to maybe possibly consider in regards to MDAs is maybe putting that in the MDA specifically, that if you come for substantial changes to density, and this would apply to the actual builders, not necessarily the developer only, but to the actual builder as well. If you're coming in asking for a change in density or something like that, part of that request will require you to go through the process of or give the city the option to require you to comply with the updated city standards.
and that's one of the things I talked about with the MDA group was we need to take better advantage of that opportunity when an amendment request comes in, to use it as a negotiation and not just say, what are you asking for? Sure, we'll give it to you, but really sit down and say, hey, that's fine that you're asking for this. Here's some things that we've recognized that we would like to change, and really take that opportunity to negotiate
Absolutely.
at that time.
Absolutely.
And I'm really excited about the MDA group that's happening because it's an opportunity to learn from all mistakes of past MDAs. Not mistakes, but, insufficiencies we found in other agreements that we'd like to fix in this new way of doing it. Yeah, I think that.
So no pressure, is that what you're telling me?
Opportunities for improvement.
No, but I think that what, Sherry was articulating earlier is that I think what's good about this process, it's iterative, right, and everybody has a chance to review these things, but there's a whole bunch of eyes reviewing and discussing and pulling apart and getting into these minutia things that oftentimes just haven't been really vested through, in some of these previous MDAs, right? So I think there's an opportunity to do it better.
I know we,
Sherry wants us to do it perfectly. That's her standard. So we have to get pretty close to
I
that.
think the biggest weapon we have to do it better is Jace.
yes, that's one of the big things we have. Jared, I hope you're still on with us. I know we've been going at this for some time. Do you have any thoughts or anything you wanna add to all of this?
Honestly, I had to step out and miss the majority of the conversations of
You
this
fell
last 5 minutes, or so I'll have to catch up.
Okay. I think that has staff and the members of the particular working groups, have they got all the direction they need from this body so that we can continue to move forward with this? I'm looking at staff, yes, all staff. Okay, if there's no further discussion on this item, right, no further discussion, no further questions, I am
Motion to adjourn.
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye, we are done! Before 10! I saw you guys all looking at the clock, huh? Are we gonna hit it? We're gonna hit 4:10? Huh?
I took the under.
For those of you who don't ever get